Good day, everyone. Welcome to this special video recording brought to you by PROPEL Youth and Gender. The climate financing activity aims to catalyze and accelerate access to green climate fund financing for more robust gender and youth responsive gender assessments and gender and social inclusion action plans, along with their implementation, focusing on increasing access to FP in primary health care to achieve key outcomes such as increased uptake of family planning services. Today, I'm going to provide a short progress update. I'd also like to take this opportunity to encourage the AOR team to move forward with the Madagascar country concurrence request. Madagascar is presently preparing to complete a new GCF gender and social inclusion action plan over the coming months. We would like to take advantage of this timely opportunity. I will discuss the following points: gender transformative programming approaches vis-a-vis climate financing, sub-activities, milestones and deliverables, metrics and dashboards, correlations and mapping, and next steps. I'd like to start by acknowledging the 2023 Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment Policy, which identifies promising approaches to advance gender transformative programming related to climate financing. The implementation of all of these approaches requires financing. This activity focuses on just that. As you are well aware, PROPEL Youth and Gender scope focuses on these three key areas: gender, youth, and the intersection of youth and gender. This activity pursues a dual strategy at both the global level and country level. These mutually reinforcing tracks have an initial focus on the health, agriculture, livelihoods, and forest sectors. Increased financing and more robust activity design is expected to lead to more and better gender and youth responsive activities that will lead to improved outcomes. The activity focuses on IR2 financing. However, there are elements relating to IRs 1 and 3. Great. So this is a summary of our sub-activities, milestones, and deliverables from the approved concept note. Today, we will be focusing on country mapping. So why did we do this? First, it's a stock-taking exercise related to the gender, youth, family planning, and climate situation in all PRH and primary impact countries. Second, it begins to lay the groundwork to identify potential indicators for GCF assessments and action plans. And third, it sheds some light on the relationships between key indicators with a view to leveraging increased financing for gender transformative and youth responsive programming. So we started with a review of MDG 5 gender equality and MDG 13 climate action metrics. Unfortunately, many of the MDG indicators do not have data, particularly for sub-Saharan African countries. For example, systems tracking and making public allocations for gender equality and women's empowerment. We found that many of those indicators of the MDG indicators were also likely outside of the scope of this activity. We proceeded to identify priority and summary metrics relating to country economics, gender, youth, population, and climate. We then prepared these into dashboards with an initial focus on Niger, Nigeria, and Madagascar, the three countries that express strong interest in receiving TA from PROPEL Youth and Gender to advance the development of new action plans or implementation of existing action plans. I'd like to walk through the index indicators as those are likely to be less familiar to you. First, the Global Youth Development Index measures progress on 27 indicators across 6 domains of youth development, health and well-being, education and employment and opportunity, political and civic participation, equality and inclusion, and peace and security. You can see that Niger ranks 177th out of 181 assessed countries. The Gender Development Index measures gender inequalities related to human development, life expectancy, expected schooling among children, average schooling among adults, and estimated earned income. You can see Niger ranks among the bottom 10 for this metric. Moving to Nigeria, the Women's Inequality Index incorporates maternal mortality ratio, adolescent birth rate, secondary education, parliamentary seats, and labor force participation. Nigeria ranks at the very bottom for this index, 165th out of 166 countries. The Global Adaptation Index summarizes a country's vulnerability to climate change and other global challenges in combination with its readiness to improve resilience. 36 indicators contribute to the measure of vulnerability, and 9 contribute to the measure of readiness. Vulnerability measures a country's exposure, sensitivity, and capacity to adapt to the negative effects of climate change by considering the sectors of food, water, health, ecosystem service, human habitat, and infrastructure. Madagascar ranks at the very bottom. Readiness measures a country's ability to leverage investments and convert them to adaptation actions by considering 3 components: economic readiness, governance, and social readiness. Again, Madagascar ranks at the very bottom for these metrics. As I mentioned earlier, one of the reasons we undertook this activity was to better understand the relationships between key indicators with a view to leveraging increased financing for gender transformative and youth responsive programming. So one way to do that is using correlation analysis. As we can see here, there are some strong relationships between the Youth Progress Index and the Global Adaptation Index, the Women's Inequality Index and the Global Adaptation Index, Intimate Partner Violence and the Global Adaptation Index, Intimate Partner Violence and the Readiness Score, and Intimate Partner Violence and Environmental Health Score. And finally, Modern Contraceptive Prevalence Rate and the Vulnerability Score. So let's look at that in a two-way chart for the 43 PRH and primary impact countries for a few of these correlations. And here we can see all of those countries in this bubble chart, looking at the negative correlation between a country's adaptation score and women's inequality index. So as women's inequality increases, or women's inequality erodes, or equality erodes, adaptation is also negatively impacted. We can also look at the environmental health score in relation to intimate partner violence and see there's also a negative correlation between those two metrics. And finally, we can note that in relation to the vulnerability score and the modern contraceptive prevalence rate, there also seems to be a trend, a correlation between those two metrics as well, with countries being scoring lower on the vulnerability score as modern contraceptive rate increases. So now I would like to turn to the global mapping exercise. So as you can imagine, we have gathered a lot of interesting information, and we'd like to look at that with you together just to review some of the key metrics. And so here we have mapped all of the PRH and primary impact countries for the Youth Progress Index alongside youth populations. So youth populations being in purple. And so we can note that in most countries, the youth populations are around 40% of the total population. And so if we just look at Madagascar, falls right on that metric, and youth progress also with higher scores indicating better youth progress, most countries are somewhere in the high 40s or 50 range. So as you can imagine, if we come over to West Africa, we can see in Nigeria, for example, the Youth Progress Index is around 52. So moving along to looking at family planning, we can see that modern contraceptive prevalence rate and unmet need are plotted by country on this map. And the interesting thing is that in most regions, if we look to compare countries, the modern contraceptive prevalence is far higher than unmet need, with the exception, and we can see that to be true for most of Southern and Eastern Africa, South Asia, and also Southeast Asia. However, we come over to West Africa, we can see pretty much there is an opposite trend where many countries in West Africa are having a higher unmet need compared to the overall modern contraceptive prevalence rate. So we can also look at gender-based violence using the same approach and looking at the proportion of women who agree with beating one's spouse under certain circumstances. And in most countries, there tends to be those rates or the women indicating that belief are higher than the actual women who reporting intimate partner violence. However, there are some exceptions to that. In particular, very notably, is that the difference between Bangladesh, in this case, only 17% of women agreeing with the beating of a spouse under certain circumstances, compared to India, where 41% of women agree with that notion, versus the actual report of intimate partner violence being at 50% in Bangladesh, compared to only 18% in India. And then lastly, we have on our chart here, females married by the age of 14, or 15 rather. And so we can, again, compare those statistics across countries using this approach. So lastly, I'm going to jump to some of our climate indicators. And so keep in mind that the Global Adaptation Index, the Environmental Performance Index are just two different metrics with lots of different underlying indicators. However, in most countries, they are fairly on par with each other, and there is some variation between certain countries that are higher performing on the Global Adaptation Index versus the Environmental Performance Index. So with that, I would like to come back to our final slide and just briefly note that some of the next steps, and we are now preparing to move forward with the planned GCF process review and gender action plan review. And we would like to follow up country concurrence for Madagascar as quickly as possible to engage with the mission and key local stakeholders to support development of a new gender action plan that is moving forward now. We don't want to miss this window of opportunity. Thank you.